Okay, this is my presentation on the Roman water system, looking at where they got their water from and what they used it for in their city and how they disposed of it. So, spring water was renowned by the Romans because they recognized it as more pure and better than other types of water. Particularly hot springs were valued for their healing properties, and Vitruvius has numerous notes on the taste of water varying based on the type of soil it's in and what it's gone through. And so they cared a lot about their quality of water, and you see that in their most kind of renowned aspect of their water system, which is their aqueducts, because they wanted to bring that high quality water into the city. And so they had a total of 11 aqueducts by the time of the traditional fall of Rome. The longest is about 62 miles long. So these were massive in length, massive in the amount of water they carried, and did a lot to get the city the water it needed. Much of the length was, like you see in this photo here, a trough, often covered, sometimes not, just because that was a cheaper way to run it, and it could be moved around mountains. When mountains were too big, they would have to do a variety of options. They would either dig a tunnel through the mountain, like you see there, with some air shafts, and when digging, they would dig from each side of the mountain, and then one team would turn to the left, one team would turn to the right, and then one of them would dig a tunnel to nowhere, and the other would hit the other tunnel, and so they could reliably connect the tunnels each time they had to make a new one. The most iconic part of the aqueduct that we see is the aqueduct bridge, the arcades, and those were used sometimes to traverse a valley, like you see there, but most often they were used close to the city to allow for water to move through, but still allow traffic to move underneath. More commonly in the mountains, they would use an inverted siphon to get through a valley. Which looks like this. It's got a upper tank, and then pipes that go down into the valley, a support structure at the bottom, and the pipes rise up the other side into a second tank at a lower elevation than the first. And so I've made a simple siphon here to demonstrate the principle. Just using 2 cups into some straws, so you can see exactly how it would have worked. So as the water goes in and builds up in the first tank, the pressure just from gravity pushing down on the water here creates more force going down into this pipe than it takes to travel up and out of the second pipe. So you can see if the inflow was consistent, this water, the pressure would remain high enough for the flow to be consistent throughout the whole system. But if that lower tank were too high of an elevation, you can see the water wouldn't be able to make it through, get stuck right around there. So it had to be at a lower elevation, and then the water could flow as they needed it to. And so that was one. To maintain the level throughout the arcades, or those troughs that we saw earlier, they would use the corybates to level. And so it's just a wooden structure here with these hanging weights, and then a water trough in the middle. And so they could use those things together to find level, and then they would line up about 40 feet down the line, someone with a measuring stick, and they would see the difference in height down the line compared to the height where they're at. They could find the slope that they were dealing with, and they would know how much needed to be added to the slope to bring it to the angle they wanted, or how much had to be dug out. So now along the line of the aqueduct, water theft became an almost expected practice by those who were in charge of managing the water in Rome. Frontinus talks about it. He's a little obsessed with it, in fact. He came up with all these measurements to figure out how much water should be going through the aqueducts and how much was being siphoned off. But even he says, the delivery of certain waters in place of others under false names is a category of wrongdoing that seemed to require direct correction, even though this belongs among transgressions less serious than the rest. So while he thinks it needs to be solved, he doesn't place a lot of emphasis on it. He doesn't think that it's the greatest sin a Roman can commit. And he says he's not even sure that it can be stopped. It's because it became such a common practice. When they did need to change flow in the city, they used the castellum, which was just a stone or brass box that had different gates within it, so they could shut off in times of drought, or if they wanted to cut off a certain supply line, they could lift those gates and then control where the water was going in the city. Now, for some of the uses within the city, the public bathrooms were a huge one. They were valued as much for their social aspects as much as a necessity for the city. And they're mainly for use by poor men. Women, even lower class women, usually wouldn't risk going into a public restroom except for in case of emergency, for fear of being robbed or raped. And the wealthy men kind of viewed it as disgusting to be in there with lower class individuals, and they could afford to have private restrooms on their property, and so they would not use this. And interestingly, this is one of the building projects within the water system that we don't see names attached to give credit to whoever financed the project. So we can tell from that people probably weren't super proud to have to build it or to provide it for the city, but it was a necessity. They wanted to get the lower classes waste out of the streets. Often connected, these bathrooms, were often connected to a public bathhouse as a larger complex, and these became part of the daily routine for almost every Roman. They would work in the morning until mid-afternoon, and then everyone would go to the bathhouses. It was very cheap entry, and so it allowed the different classes to sort of intermingle, where lower class could have an opportunity to talk with upper class, or upper class could go and flex how many slaves they had to attend to them while they're in the bathhouse. And there were a variety of different bath options, different temperatures, and other facilities: steam rooms, libraries, lecture halls, the bathrooms, and fields for games. And so it was really more than just a bathhouse. It was a social center of the city. And then the naumachia is a staged naval battle. So similar to the Romans would stage land battles, they would do the same in artificial lakes. And so the first one we have record of was in 46 BCE by Julius Caesar after his victories in Egypt. And it was really popular. Suetonius recorded, it was such a crowd flocked to all these shows from every quarter that many strangers had to lodge in tents pitched in streets or along the roads. And the crush was often such that many were crushed to death, including 2 senators. So people are trying to see it and get close to it, and they're literally crushing each other to death. And so with that popularity, of course, it was it was not only held once. There we go. It was again done by Augustus in 2 BCE, and he built a lake down near the floodplain of the Tiber, and he built a whole new aqueduct, Aqua Alsietina, to supply water. So they built that so they could use less pure water for this purpose rather than taking from the drinking water supply of the city. And that basin that he built was used by Claudius in 52 CE, with the largest one we have on record with 19,000 men. But it didn't really go well. They didn't want to be a part of it, and they kept trying to get out of it. They weren't really fighting each other, but once they realized that they weren't getting out of it, they eventually fought, and the survivors were eventually pardoned. But it's kind of viewed as not a super successful event. Nero, in 57 CE, used that same basin, and Titus, to celebrate the completion of the Colosseum, had a final naumachia in that same basin that Augustus had built. And later, the Colosseum could even be flooded, either shallowly, to have men and animals fight in shallow water, or it could be flooded enough that flat-bottomed ships built just for it could be in there. So it could happen in the Colosseum too. Drinking water is the most intuitive use for the water they brought to the city, and it was the public fountains that were built throughout the city were the only option for lower class citizens. Upper class had cisterns on their property or wells on their property, but within the city, this was the only option. But they weren't in short supply. They were numerous, and just having these, they were lavish displays of the wealth of Rome. Not only in their style, like you see with the Trevi fountain there, but also just the fact that Rome could have water consistently moving through their city showed how wealthy they were. And it allowed for ample water supply for their citizens without fear of depleting local water sources. They didn't have to worry about the water level, the groundwater level lowering, because they weren't pulling from that. And so it allowed them to have a much denser, much higher population than other cities could at the same time period. Now, to get the water out of the city, the main drain is the Cloaca Maxima. Literally, it just means the greatest drain. Originally, it was a natural stream that had been lined with stones, and it was used to drain the Tiber River floodplain all the way back to when Etruscan kings ruled the area. And it was just built upon piecemeal based on their current needs. So it slowly became larger and covered, and then different tributaries would run from around the city, from bathhouses or from wherever the water was coming from, and it would all feed into the Cloaca Maxima. And Pliny the Elder brags about this drain. He says, "In the streets above, massive blocks of stone are dragged along it, and yet the tunnels do not cave. They are pounded by falling buildings. The ground is shaken by earth tremors. But in spite of it all, for 700 years, from the time of Tarquinius Priscus, the channels have remained well nigh impregnable." And that Roman pride on their water system, you can see it in a lot of their writings. And Frontinus is a great example. He's really proud. He says, "With these grand structures, so numerous and indispensable, carrying so many waters, who indeed would compare the idol pyramids or other," I don't know what that is, something, "although renowned works of the Greeks." And I think you can argue that comparison a little bit, because obviously, while they are useful, a lot of the times these structures are built, for the glory of Rome, for the glory of the financier, whatever emperor built them. But you can't argue that about his comment on their usefulness. They stood the test of time. the Agua Virgo still feeds the Trevi Fountain today. And their whole style of water management, water supply, laid the foundation for future cities, things that we use today. We don't require immediate access to water for a city to be built somewhere. We can bring water to it. Siphons and pumps it's all very much traceable directly to the Romans and their water system. And so you can argue maybe the reasons they were built, but you can argue the impact that they had on the rest of the world.